creatures, single cellular organisms, photosynthetic. They're swimming around in water, in the lakes, in moist areas, and in the ocean. In fact, they produce most of our oxygen. Depending on who you believe, from 60 to 80% of oxygen on the planet is produced by these tiny creatures. When you go to the ocean, you take a gulp, you're actually ingesting lots of these organisms. They don't cause disease. Now, that's the diatoms. Dinoflagellates, there's tons of them that's out there too, but very few are pathogenic. And if I say to you red tides or toxic blooms, you probably have heard that before, especially if you're a surfer. So I'm going to show you what I mean in a second. But nonetheless, if you look at the pathogenic forms, we have very few species, very few species of dinoflagellates causing disease. In fact, I'm going to list them here for you. Here's a few genera. So these are names of genera, not specific species. Goniolax, Gymnodinium, Alexandrium. They are actually involved with what we call toxic blooms or red tides. So again, you see very few species. So if you take a look at the United States in particular, if you look at the coastal areas, every little spot that you see back here, these are the different types of episodes that we see that involves these creatures back here, tiny single cellular organisms, Goniolax, Gymnodinium, Alexandria. So red tides, what are red tides and toxic blooms? Here's an example. This one actually turned out to be a toxic bloom. So first of all, let me step back. Dinoflagellates, they are photosynthetic. They're like plants in this regard, but they're single cellular, very microscopic, right? But they do have chlorophyll. These are pigments that are involved with photosynthesis. And again, chlorophyll can be of different colors. Think about leaves on trees, on plants in general. You see different colors, right? That depends on the type of chlorophyll that's involved with photosynthesis that plant has. Now take a look at this here. This is in the ocean. This one is a toxic bloom. So imagine I have species like this that actually produce a chlorophyll, different color chlorophyll. In this case, it's red. So this one is called a red toxic bloom. And by the way, not all red tides are toxic. It depends on the species. We're going to find out why these are toxic in a second. But here's how it works. Imagine I have major rainfall, all right? You probably go to the beach here and when it's raining like crazy or when there's a sewage spill. Well, there's signs all over the place. Don't go surfing, don't go swimming. There's a reason for it. Because some of these species that produce these colors can be very toxic to us. So in this case, you have major rainfall or sewage spill. All that stuff goes into the ocean. There's more nutrients. And just by chance, I might have a certain species that actually grows, except the species have a certain color because of the chlorophyll. And in this case, it's a red chlorophyll. It represents species that cause what we call a toxic bloom or a red tide. Now, here's what happens, all right? As these organisms increase in numbers, shellfish start eating them. Think about clams. Think about mussel. Think about crabs. Think about oysters. All those organisms they can feed. And of course, there's a food chain, right? So again, it can go up from your shellfish to crabs and fish, maybe. And then you come by and you consume those toxic, let's just say mussel or clams. There's tons of toxins that can be in the flesh of those animals. So now you get that toxin in your system. So most of the time, these pathogens I mentioned, Goniolax, Gymnodinium, Alexandrium, they don't really grow in you, but they contaminated some other thing that you ate, and now the toxin is in you. So I'll just show you just a few toxins that are produced. And again, if you think about what these toxins do, you can see why this can be very lethal. Most people actually survive, all right? So we have brevitoxin, shigua-toxin, domoic acid, ocadoic acid. All of these are examples of toxins that are produced by these single cellular organisms that accumulate in shellfish that you eat. Now, here's what I want you to know. You don't have to memorize the names of these toxins, but they have major effects. For example, they can affect the nervous system. All right, this is the most important one. So when they affect the central nervous system, typically you can't move. You can slip into a coma. You can have a problem with the respiratory function. Think about this, your respiratory muscles are not functioning very effectively anymore. So this is where it becomes a problem. Generally, most people survive, but there have been deaths linked to these organisms that produce their toxins that accumulate in shellfish. All right, so keep that in mind. So the biggest problem would be paralysis, basically respiratory paralysis caused by the toxins that these organisms produce. All right, so I want to move away from diatoms that don't cause disease in humans. dinoflagellates, which most don't cause disease in humans, except for a few species that I just mentioned, Goniolax, Gymnodinium, and Alexandrium. Those are the major ones. There are some others, but those are the major species. Now, I want to move on to the major parasites, the single cellular parasites that cause disease in humans. Now, first of all, it's always good to have a perspective of where these organisms kind of fit. So here's one way to classify them. We have amoebas. Amoebas, they're single cellular, of course, but they move around in liquid areas. Think about water. Think about moist soil. Think about rivers. Think about lakes, right? And here's think about food and water that you're drinking. It might contain these organisms, but again, very few cause disease in humans. So they move around like this. You know what a cell looks like. These ones, they have cytoplasmic extensions. These are called pseudopods. They look like little false feet, but this is how they move around. The cytoplasm kind of bulges out to create these false feet. So those are the amoebas, and that's what I want to focus on for this group. Then the flagellates, again, single cellular organism. Notice that they have flagella right over here. And again, we have some major parasites that belong to this category. So they move around not by pseudopods, but by flagella. Then there's one organism that actually has these little hairs on the surface. That's cilia. In fact, there's only one organism that causes disease in humans that are ciliates, and that's Balantidium coli. All right, so that's this one here. And then, of course, we have these other ones. These tend to be parasitic to us. And again, very few compared to the total, right? But if I said to you malaria, if I said to you babesia, they belong to this category. So we have four major groups: amoeba, flagellates, ciliates, and then the apicomplexa, or the or the sporozoans, typically obligate intracellular parasites like the Plasmodium species that cause malaria. All right, so I'm going to do a little trek. Again, it's a little survey of these organisms that cause disease in humans. I'm just going to point out the more significant ones. All right, so here we go. These are organisms that cause disease of the skin and the digestive system. Two major species, Leishmania major and then Leishmania donovani. There are some other species of Leishmania that cause disease. So again, names of disease, causative agent, signs and symptoms. It's going to be very important now. When we look at parasites, it's going to be very different, like from what we talked about fungi or bacteria, even viruses. The way to understand parasitic diseases, we can't escape this. We have to understand their life cycles. But you're going to see very complicated life cycles later on. I'm going to point out exactly what I want you to know. Usually some of these things are transmitted to us by insects, for example, mosquitoes. I want you to know what the infective stage is. What is it that mosquito has? When it bites us, it transmits this thing to us. And then what is the form that we see in humans? See, we see this throughout our parasitology here. Lots of life cycles. Don't let that confuse you. All right, don't get frustrated. All these life cycles, and they're different. I don't care about all those life cycles, all the different stages. What I would care about, though, is what is the infective form or the infective stage of that parasite, and what do you see in the human, all right? So we can take a huge complex life cycle and boil it down to two things. What infects us, and what do we see once we have that infection, all right? Okay, so we have cutaneous leishmaniasis, and then we have visceral. Visceral means internal organs. Specifically, in this case, primarily it's going to be the liver. So the organisms would be Leishmania major and then Leishmania donovani. So this is what we would see. On the skin, of course, you're going to see sores. In the internal area, you might see swollen or inflamed liver. All right? Now, notice this is transmitted by a vector. Remember what a vector is? A vector is something like arthropods, for example. There's a mosquito flying around, bites infected. Bites someone who has a parasite, picks up that in the blood, and then transmits this to another individual. So again, now we have infections here, all right? So again, I know you don't like my drawing. I can't really work too well with this little pointer or this little marker here. In any case, let's take a look at the disease, all right? Look at me for a second. What do I want? Names of organisms, disease they cause, signs and symptoms, all right? And of course, vectors. And we're going to tag a couple of things onto this also. What is the infection state? And what do we see in the humans? All right? So I'm going to lay this out nice and hopefully clearly for you. All right, so let's take a look at disease of the skin caused by parasites. we're looking at leishmaniasis. All right. Now, notice this is transmitted by this vector here. So this parasite, leishmania, is transmitted by the phlebotomous fly. That's a technical name for the sandfly. Now, we don't see too much around here, sandfly, but I actually grew up in a developing country way back when, and I can tell you, these flies, it's not just one fly flying across and just happens to come in contact with you. Man, you have thousands of flies per swarm, all right? So again, keep that in mind. Imagine if you had an infectious swarm. You had thousands of flies that actually has the parasite. So what? Well, the next slide I'm going to show you, going to just tell you what can happen on the skin when it comes to phlebotomous or the sandfly and this parasite that we call leishmania. Take a look at this. All right, so here's a kid. If you notice, lots of bites here. So imagine here's tons of flies flying around. And he just got unlucky being caught in the storm. And they just bit him like crazy. So every single area back here, it's a bite from a sandfly, except in this case, what happens, those flies actually transmitted the parasite into the skin, into the cutaneous area. So this is a close-up. You can see multiple bites. They will develop over time, but ultimately, this is what you would see. Now, this is what we call cutaneous. In other words, it has to do with the skin. And the major one that causes this problem is Leishmania major. So Leishmania major causes cutaneous leishmaniasis. So that's one little fact I want you to know. Again, we're going to take a look at what we see if we were to actually do a biopsy of this, or to just get a specimen or a sample and put it on the slide. These are the things that we're going to see, all right? But we're going to see this with a life cycle in a second. Now, the other form is called visceral leishmaniasis. It's also, you go to places like Turkey, the Mediterranean, you probably will hear a term called kala azar. Kala azar. This is a visceral form of leishmaniasis. What happens, the parasite actually enters white blood cells, and of course, where white blood cells go, macrophages in particular, you can see the parasite there. And I'm going to show you again a few examples in a bit. So white blood cells, especially macrophages, can be anywhere in the body. In the liver, they're called Kupffer cells. So if you've taken Bio 163 with me, we talked about the immune system, we talked about macrophages. The macrophages in the alveoli are called alveolar macrophages. The ones in the liver, they're called Kupffer cells, but they are macrophages. And again, the macrophages actually pick up the parasite. So here's a kid. So two individuals, you can tell this is not abnormal. This is one is cutaneous, that's Leishmania major. This other one is Leishmania donovani. It's a very nasty organism. So imagine, here comes that sandfly, bites a kid, injects the parasite into the bloodstream. The parasite moves around, it gets to the liver. And you can tell that's not normal at all. That's a distended liver. So again, this is inflammation of the liver. It can be quite deadly, by the way. All right. So again, before I show you the life cycle, let me just show you a few other things back here. There's a condition called post-kala azar dermal leishmaniasis. In this case, what happens, Leishmania donovani seems to be latent, kind of hangs around for a bit, and then it shows up like this. It's less deadly, but nonetheless, you can see this is now a cutaneous disease. Now, again, I don't ask you to memorize stats, but when you hear these numbers, it's really incredible. Leishmaniasis, visceral form. In other words, this type here affects over 100 million people. That's like about a third of the United States population. That's incredible. All right. Again, we're not infected by here because we don't have the reservoirs for this pathogen, which is a parasite. All right. And there's about 500,000, 500,000 new cases, and every single year about 50,000 people die. So even though we don't see this nasty problem here, we do see when people migrate. We see that very infrequently, but nonetheless, you live particularly in the Mediterranean area in Africa, this is a huge problem, right? So here's where it's going to get a little complex. And again, don't let this slide mess with your mind. There's only a few things I want you to know. Infectious stage, and then what you find in the human, all right? And then the vector, of course. So here's that sandfly. Let's start back here. I'm going to point out what I want you to know. This is the vector. Imagine I have a human who has this infection. A sandfly comes by, bites that human, picks up a form of the parasite. And then this parasite it develops in the sandfly, and this is what it becomes. So here's what I want you to see. That little eye, that stands for infective stage. That's what I want you to know. The infective stage is a promastigote. All right? So this is a promastigote. The sandfly comes by, it bites a human. Now this is in the bloodstream or the skin. What happens in the skin or in the liver, for example, here's what develops. That parasite becomes an amastigote. So this is the diagnostic stage. So I'm going to point out the three things I want you to know. The infective stage, which is the promastigote. All right? The diagnostic stage, this is what you find in the human. That's the amastigote stage. And then, of course, the vector. So 1, 2, 3. These are the things I want you to know. Hopefully that makes sense to you, right? 1, 2, and 3. Promastigote infective stage. You can actually do a little diagram for yourself as we go through this and you start studying for this exam that's going to come up. This is going to be part of your final, right? I want you to start thinking 2 weeks from now. You'll be taking an exam, and this is what it looks like, all right, for these parasites. Promastigote infectious stage, diagnostic stage is amastigote, and the vector, of course, it is the sandfly. I told you I'd show you some pictures of this. All right, this is the amastigote. This isn't a blood cell. This isn't a white blood cell. That's called a Kupffer cell. A Kupffer cell is a macrophage that you find in the liver. All right, so you can see the parasites right over here. That's the amastigote form. Imagine this is in the liver. So here's the liver, and I got tons of these cells that are infected. It's going to cause inflammation, right? Because these cells actually they produce a bunch of different parasites inside them, and they release something called cytokines that induces inflammation. So this is a very nasty problem. All right, now I want to move on to diseases of the intestinal tract and, of course, the genital urinary tract. So we can look at giardiasis, cryptosporidiosis, cyclosporiasis, amoebiasis, really nasty organism, Entamoeba histolytica, and then the only STD transmitted to humans is a parasitic one. This is trichomoniasis, goes by Trichomonas vaginalis. So again, name of disease, causative agent, signs and symptoms, and then the transmission here. All right? Okay, so the first one is Giardia. It used to be called Giardia lamblia, but the name now is Giardia intestinalis. So here's what I want you to know. You get this parasite from contaminated food and water. So this is what it looks like. This is a nice little high-resolution image. And I'll show you some pictures in a minute. It's a single-cellular organism. Let me just say, typical people who are infected, the symptoms appear in about 7 days or so. You have nausea, cramps, flatulence, diarrhea. Sometimes it can be quite painful. So let's talk about the life cycle, all right? First of all, there are two forms. All right, so in fact, let me introduce them here for you. I don't see it, but I'm going to point it out for you. The trophozoite. Troph means to eat. All right, this is the form that feeds. It's the form that replicates. The other form is the cyst. So cysts, they're like spores, not like bacterial spores, but they're very resilient. So there are two forms for this organism, a trophozoite, the actively feeding form, and the cyst. Typically, we get infected by consuming food or water that contains the cyst form. So that's the infective stage. All right, so let's go for this. So again, life cycles again. If you take a look at this here, here's apples and here's some water. This is what is contained in them. Here's a cyst form of this organism. Humans consume it, the cyst gets to the intestinal tract, and then they become this form. This is the trophozoite form. So the infective stage is the cyst form. The ones that move about to cause a problem, it is a trophozoite form. By the way, I've seen this many times in my practice. Let me just say, it's probably the cutest parasite to look at, literally. You guys have seen bacillus, right? This is Gram-Stain. Remember, the gram-positive rod, pretty large. This one is about maybe it's about 30 microns or so. So this is about 5, 6, 7 times, or even 10 times bigger than the bacillus that you saw. It's about 30 times bigger than E. coli. And when you look at it, the trophozoite just looks back at you. See those eyes? Those are nuclei, by the way. You don't have to worry about the structures, but it looks like a little pear. And you see the flagella back here, all right? So this is like two eyes looking back at you. This one has a little mustache. I just love to see them, but they're very nasty organisms. All right, so again, Giardia causes an intestinal disease. Typically, humans get infected by consuming food or water that contains the cyst form. That's the infective stage. What do you see in stool? You see the trophozoite form. This is the diagnostic. You can also find cyst, by the way. This is taken from stool. So this is it's a very small area, right? You can see lots of parasites back here. Okay, now the other two I'm going to put together. The one that causes what we call cyclosporiasis, and the next one is cryptosporidiasis. All right, here's why I'm going to put them together. Generally, if you're healthy, don't worry about the life cycle. This one is too complex. So again, it does cause an intestinal disease, but generally, if you're healthy, no problem at all. The big problem comes in with what we saw before, HIV/AIDS patients. Really, really nasty problem. So again, we have diarrhea, it's an intestinal disease caused by Cyclospora cataensis. Disease is cyclosporiasis. The other one is cryptosporidiasis, caused by Cryptosporidium parvum and hominis, especially this one here. And the biggest thing I want you to know about this, in fact, really the only thing I want you to know about it's a major problem for HIV/AIDS patients. Not just have the virus, but again, they have AIDS, which is the disease state, a further disease state, where they have opportunistic infections. And this is one of the parasites that can wipe out an AIDS patient, all right? Healthy individuals, not much of a problem. Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora. The biggest thing I want you to know is AIDS patients, HIV/AIDS patients are the biggest target. This thing can kill them in a matter of weeks, all right? Maybe even 2 or 3 weeks if they have a heavy infection. So that's a very important one. This is why I don't want you to memorize the life cycle. It's not going to help you with anything. So don't waste time on the life cycle of Cryptosporidium or Cyclospora. Just remember, make that connection. Healthy individuals, not much of a problem at all. HIV/AIDS patients, big problem, right? Okay. Now, I just mentioned to you that these parasites, they have 2 different stages. The cyst is like a spore. We don't call it a spore, but it's dormant. It's kind of resilient. It can hang around the environment for a long time. Don't forget this, the most resilient biological structures are spores, bacterial spores. Man, they can hang around for 700, the oldest one, 703 million years old. That's a long time. These cysts, they can degrade over time, so they're not as resilient as bacterial spores. And again, just to bring home the point, you have cysts, these are the dormant forms. They enter the body, they have lots of nutrients, they become the trophozoite. All right, the trophozoite is what causes disease. This is usually, the cyst is usually the infective state. All right, now I want to move on to some other parasites that cause, single cellular ones, that cause disease in the intestinal tract. And again, let's start off with this one. This is a very, very bad one to have. Again, very few parasites like this cause disease in humans, but this one is really nasty, all right? It causes a disease called amoebic dysentery. And again, you see that term like amoebic dysentery, not just dysentery, because Shigella can cause dysentery, that's a bacterium. This one is amoebic, so that's actually amoebas involved with this, right? Amoebic dysentery. So I can summarize this slide by telling you this. Here's this pathogen, it's called Entamoeba histolytica. Again, it's a very nasty parasite. We get infected generally by this. This is a cyst. Again, don't worry how you identify it. It's very easy to identify, actually. But then a cyst gets into the intestinal tract, it becomes a trophozoite. This thing kind of moves about, and it produces toxins. It produces enzymes that degrade the intestinal lining. So it can actually literally dig into tissue. And then, of course, what accompanies that is bleeding. So it's not unusual to see blood and mucus and a foul-smelling stool in individuals, all right? So it causes severe colitis. This is inflammation of the colon. All right, so this is Entamoeba histolytica. Infective stage is the cyst. This is the stage that causes the problem for us, the trophozoite stage. Let's take a look at this disease. So imagine here's person X consume water or food. And then, of course, let's just say there's cyst of Entamoeba histolytica there. What happens to that patient, all right? So here we go. There's the cyst, goes through the stomach, gets into the large intestine, even in the small intestine, but it starts growing into the trophozoite form, and then it starts digging into tissues. So now you have ulcers, all right? So ulcers are produced, there's gonna be bleeding, there's mucus and stool, all that stuff. Yes, so this is happening there. And check it out, check out this cool picture here. So this was taken from a person who has Entamoeba histolytica infection. And if you notice right over here, right, the parasite dug into the tissues. This is in the mucosal intestinal tract. And there's tons of parasites back here. So this is the primary disease. The primary disease, it occurs in the intestinal tract. But these are unique parasites too. So although the primary site of infection is the intestinal tract, here's what can happen. These parasites can move from here to a secondary site. In this case, they can move, say, to the brain, or they can move to the liver, and now we have a secondary infection. So primary amoebiasis is in the intestinal tract. Secondary is when this organism moves to a different site. This is autopsy. Brain tissue, if you notice lots of lesions back here. This is in the liver. Very terrible. And this is, of course, in the colon. Basically, you can see colitis back here. So this is a really nasty organism. Entamoeba histolytica causes a disease called amoebic dysentery. All right? Hold on for 1 second. I'll come back in a minute. All right? I just have someone visiting me, and I can't, I have to actually take care of this issue right now. So hold on for a second. I'll be back.
Okay. When do you want to get the grades done by? You want to do it?
No, next week.
Oh, so I can come back anytime?
Yeah.
You show me how to...
I will. Okay. So I'll be done with this lecture in about an hour. Actually, maybe 45 minutes.
Okay.
Maybe even before that. All right. Okay, are we good?
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, have a good one. All right, guys, I'm sorry about that. I had one of my lab TAs actually came by to ask me about grading and all that stuff. And it's something I had an appointment with her, but anyway, it's done. All right, guys. See, this is a really nasty one, right? Primary disease, intestinal tract. It can move from that site and get to other sites like the brain or the liver. So this is a very nasty one. Amoebic dysentery, amoebic encephalitis. This is when the parasite ends up in the brain. Very, very nasty condition. All right. Now I want to move on to infections of the genital tract. And again, this can be sexually transmitted. There's only one parasite that does this. Remember when we talked about bacterial STDs? Man, we talked about several of them. Chlamydia, gonorrhea, we talked about syphilis, we talked about Gardnerella vaginalis. That's, people still argue whether that can be sexually transmitted. And we talked about soft chancre by Haemophilus ducreyi, LGV by Chlamydia trachomatis. We also talked about Donovan disease, Donovanosis, right? Caused by Klebsiella granulomatous. But here's the thing. There's only one parasite that's known to be transmitted sexually, technically. And this is the one that causes trichomoniasis. The organism is Trichomonas vaginalis. It's pretty cool to look at, actually. So this is a single cellular organism. It has this membrane that undulates. It kind of moves like this. So you can actually see it live on, say, specimens from the vaginal tract or from the urethra in males. So again, the only reservoir is humans. So it can be transmitted between men and women, or men and men, or you just name it. Any sexual practice, if the genital area is contaminated with this organism or infected with this organism, you can have transmission. So it's Trichomonas vaginalis. There's not a cis stage to this one. So again, it's just direct sexual contact, all right? Now, there's been a couple of claims for this organism and disease. For example, there's some claims that this organism is linked to cancers. That really hasn't been proven. If there's a heavy infection, you can see these red spots on the cervix. All right, this is what you see. That's called strawberry cervix right there. It's also called Colpitis macularis. These are terminologies linked to Trichomonas infections in the vaginal tract and on the cervix. This is thin water. You can see it's not as thick as we would see for Neisseria gonorrhea. We saw that before when we looked at that STD. But this is frothy and very foul-smelling discharge. Again, this is caused by Trichomonas vaginalis. So this slide kind of shows you this is transmitted between humans, among humans. So the reservoir for this, it is humans. All right. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, there's only one celiate that causes disease in humans. And this parasite is called Balantidium coli. So let me summarize this slide. Typically, when we see this, it's very, very, very rare, especially in the Western world. This is primarily a pathogen of, or maybe even a commensal. In other words, it doesn't really cause disease in swines and farm animals and wild animals. So this is what happens when humans get infected. Basically, they work in a farm, maybe some stool, feces from an animal got into their food or water supply. And now the cyst that's present here actually contaminates that water or food. Person drinks or eat that stuff, and now the trophozoite actually emerges. So this is the cyst. This is the trophozoite. All right, this is the gullet. This is how the organism feeds. It's really large, actually. This is about 50 to 60 nanometers. Whereas the ones I showed you before, it's about maybe 2 or 3 times the size of a red blood cell. This would be about 6 times the size, 6 to 10 times the size of a red blood cell. All right? So they're very easy to see in stool specimens. So again, it is point number one, it's the only celiac that cause disease in humans. All right. Now, again, this just shows you the life cycle. The cyst at the infective stage, right over here, and the trophozoite is what's causing problems. I want to turn next to organisms that cause disease in the internal organs, like the blood and central nervous system. And these are the ones: malaria, babesiosis, African sleeping sickness. I know some of you probably presented these diseases in the laboratory. Chagas disease, toxoplasmosis, those caused by Toxoplasma gondii. And then, of course, something called primary amoebic dysentery caused by Naegleria fowleri. So names of disease, organisms that cause the disease, signs and symptoms, and then transmission. All right? So let's focus on these. Now, the first I'm going to attack is malaria. Let me just say a few things about malaria. And again, I don't test you on stats. But as you recall, tuberculosis last year was the #1 killer on the planet. It still is, by the way. About 2 million people died. All right? But before that time, you know what the #1 killer on the planet was? Malaria. So if you go back to about 20 years ago, if you look at the stats, anywhere between 3 to about 6 or 700 million people got malaria. That's incredible. And then, of course, about 2 to, depending on the year, 5 to 7 million people died. It's gotten a lot better. So that was the #1 killer on the planet. Not anymore. All right, so TB has taken this, but over. But malaria, caused by a single group of organisms, a plasmodium that is, it used to be the #1 killer. At some point, by the way, it will just return to that level. So just actually, we have more recent stats, 2018, I don't have that here. We have between 241 million people who gets malaria. In general, we have less than 500,000 people dying because of malaria. And if you take a look at this, about 70 to 90% of people who die because of malaria, they're under 5 years old. All right, so this is a huge problem. We primarily find it in Southeast Asia, India, and then Africa. Also in South America, but those are the major places: India, Southeast Asia, Africa. That's where we see them. Over 70% of the cases are in Africa, by the way. All right. So what causes malaria? It's the Plasmodium species. These are the 4 species, the major ones: Plasmodium vivax, Plasmodium ovale, Plasmodium malaria, and then Plasmodium falciparum. This is the worst one to get. All right. Notice this. I have a mosquito on the slide. So malaria, the pathogen that causes malaria, is transmitted from human to human by this mosquito. That's my vector. It's the mosquito vector. That's called an Anopheles species. We talked about Aedes, the black and white banding we saw last time with Zika virus, and then with things like dengue and yellow fever. It's a different mosquito that transmits this. Now, we're going to find out malaria is primarily a disease of the blood and of red blood cells and then the liver. But we're going to understand that when we look at the life cycle. These are red blood cells. Here's a normal one. All right. But take a look at these other ones. Right here. You see the parasite in the red blood cell. That's a malaria parasite. Easy to identify. I can tell you what this species is. This species is Plasmodium falciparum. It has this nice little banana shape, what we call a gametocyte. But again, you don't have to worry about the different stages back here. Primarily a disease of the liver initially, and then the red blood cells. All right? So this shows you a map of the planet where this is a huge problem. Take a look at Africa. Man, Africa, we've been talking about Africa for a long time now, right? Sub-Saharan Africa. Lots of cases of malaria. Then most cases actually occur in Africa. So the red is pretty bad. Take a look at these really deep brown areas. Western Africa, where you have a high number of cases also in Eastern Africa back here, but most of the African continent. All right? Malaria like crazy. And then we have India, Southeast Asia, and then South America. Sometimes in Central America, if you notice, take a look at this. You go to the Northern Hemisphere, Europe, United States, Canada, not many cases. At one point in time, malaria used to exist in these areas, but we've gotten rid of the reservoirs, all right? But it's still a huge problem in the Southern Hemisphere. All right. Now, to understand this disease, again, we have to look at life cycle. So I'm going to show you two different things back here, all right? And hopefully you get it. It's not very difficult at all. We're going to stick to the basics, all right? Remember what I care about, the vector, infective stage, and what you see in the human. So this slide kind of shows you what happens. Let's start at this point, all right? I'm going to tell you what I want to know. Here, I want you to know. Here's the malarial here's the malarial vector. It's called Anopheles. And again, you don't need to know that specific name. It's transmitted by mosquitoes. And maybe you do need to know that name. It's called Anopheles, all right? There's a human who has the parasite. This mosquito picks up what's known as a gametocyte stage, and I don't care that you know that, but here's the thing, the parasite's developing in the mosquito. Ultimately, this is what we see. We get to this point. So notice one here. This is my infective stage. It's called a sporozoid, all right? So here comes that mosquito is flying around, and we have this stage of the parasite in the mosquito. It's called a sporozoid. That mosquito bites a human, injects this into the blood. Usually it's a female mosquito. In fact, it is a female mosquito because she needs blood for her eggs to develop. So again, she's the one who bites the human to get blood. But while doing this, she injects the sporozoid into the bloodstream. So here's what happens first. That sporozoid goes to the liver. So this is the first site of infection, is the liver. All right? And here's what develops. In the liver, I produce more merozoites. So these are liver cells. Those liver cells rupture. The merozoites now infect red blood cells. And of course, those forms I showed you earlier, like this one here, these are the forms that you find in red blood cells. Let me go back to that slide. Here's a blood smear. All of these are red blood cells. You can see the parasites in red blood cells. All right? And then, of course, ultimately, those red blood cells break apart. These merozoites are released and infects other cells. Ultimately, what happens in these red blood cells, you form a gametocyte, and then the cycle continues. So again, here's what I want you to know. Sporozoites is the infective stage that develops in this mosquito. That sporozoid infects the liver, all right, to produce merozoites. Merozoites are released from the cell. They produce, basically, they infect red blood cells. Now, that's better shown in this slide. It shows you the same thing. But I like this other slide because it shows you the vector and the human, right? Okay, so let's kind of redo this life cycle. So here's the infective stage. That infective stage, this is the mosquito, is called a sporozoid. Gets into the bloodstream, goes to the liver, produces merozoites. Merozoites infect red blood cells. Here's red blood cells that are infected. And of course, the cycle continues this way. So this is a gametocyte again. The mosquito flies by, bites that human, picks this form up, and this form develops again into the sporozoid. All right? So just to reemphasize, the mosquito is called Anopheles. The form that infects us, or the parasite, is called the sporozoids. Two different cell types. We have the liver cell, that's a primary site right after infection, and then red blood cells. Right? So someone who has malaria, these are the types of symptoms that you see. Of course, some of them are very general, like fever, headache, sweating, tired, many different things can cause that. But generally what you see, the spleen can be involved. So you have what's called splenomegaly. So the spleen can be involved. And then, of course, you have fever and chills. All right? So here's what happens for the different species. This is what happens. You get bitten by a mosquito. Now you have that parasite in the bloodstream ultimately. When the parasites break up the red blood cell, you see a fever spike. All right, so the fever spikes caused when red blood cells are being broken up on lice. For the different species, hello? Okay, question? All right, so the fever spikes occur when the red blood cells break up. So if you take a look at this here, sometimes you can tell what species is causing the disease. If you notice, these spikes occur at different times. All right, here's what I want you to know. Just these two terms here. All right, so we have tertiary malaria. Tertiary malaria occurs every second day. And it occurs with falciparum, vivax, and ovale. So here's falciparum, Plasmodium falciparum. Here's Plasmodium ovale and vivax. All right. Here's my fever spike day one. It occurs on the second day. So here's another day, and here's a second day after that, right here. So that's called tertiary malaria. Those spikes occur because of the organism itself. They break up red blood cells at different times. But for these three species, Falciparum, Vivax, and Ovale, we see these fever spikes 2 days apart. So here's day one, day two, it's my third day is 2 days apart. I see that fever spike. Now there's something called quartan malaria. It occurs with Plasmodium malaria. It occurs on the fourth day, really. So this is really the 3 days after you see that fever spike. So here's first day, you see a fever spike. Notice these cells are breaking apart. Red blood cells are breaking apart. I have a fever spike. Here's day two. Here's day one. Here's day two. And here's day three. I see another fever spike. So sometimes these spikes, they're called paroxysm. It's a sudden recurrence or attack of a disease. In this case, you see fever and chills, but you see high temperatures, right? With the fever, it occurs when the parasites are breaking down the red blood cells. For Falciparum, Vivax, and Ovale, that's called tertiary malaria. You see it on the second day after the first spike. And then for quartan malaria, caused by Plasmodium malariae, you see this every third day. And again, there are variations of this. Do not worry about that here, right? So I want you to know these two terms, quotient and then tertiary. All right. Now, the worst species, they're all bad, but the worst species to get infected by is this one here, Plasmodium falciparum. Right? It produces a disease called black water fever or black urine fever. Here's what it looks like. So again, remember this occurs every 2 days, right? For Falciparum, Vivax, and Ovale. So we're looking specifically at Falciparum. So here's what happens. Here's a patient who actually has Falciparum infection. It's a very nasty one. It's very resistant to anti-malarial drugs. But you see, most of the cells are infected. This is taken from a blood smear from that patient. Check it out. Over 70% of the red blood cells are infected. That's crazy. Then you start lysing the red blood cell, you release hemoglobin and all that stuff in blood. And then, of course, many of these things end up in urine. So this is what you see from day zero. All right, this is when you have a spike, red blood cells are breaking up. You see a lot of black urine back here. This is what's produced in that patient. Then it kind of clears up on 40, like by 2 days or so, and then the cycle starts over again. So this is called black water fever or black urine fever. Nonetheless, it's caused by the most vicious of these species, and it is called Plasmodium vivax. Plasmodium falciparum. All right. Now, the next disease on the list is babesiosis. This is caused by an organism called Babesia. There are many different species, but microtis. So what do I want you to know about this? Well, if you take a look at the blood smear, it kind of looks like malaria, right? Except this is not transmitted by mosquitoes. It's transmitted by a tick. So let me just summarize this life cycle for you. Just like malaria, the sporozoites is in the infective stage. We have many animals like cows and sheep and goats and mice. They can carry the pathogen. But here's the thing, the tick bites these animals and come bite you. So the infective state is like what we saw, the sporozoites. And of course, they develop into merozoites, and this is what we have back here, all right? So we see in blood, these actually have trophozoites in there, all right? Now, even though they look alike, so let me go back to the Plasmodium slide. All right, you see right here, this is red blood cells again. You see the parasites in the red blood cells. This is for malaria. Let me go back to Babesia. With Babesia, you do see parasites in red blood cells. Well, here's what you don't see. This is called a Maltese cross. And again, you don't have to know this business, but we don't see this Maltese cross, this type of structure that you see in malaria. All right, so that's how we can distinguish it. Even though the other things kind of look alike what you see for malaria, we don't see the Maltese cross in malaria. All right. So just a couple others, and then we quit for the day. So we're going to just complete all the single cellular ones and leave the worms for Wednesday. All right? So bear with me for a bit. The next disease on the list is toxoplasmosis. And this is caused by a parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. So what do I want you to know from this? Well, here's how this disease occurs. We get infected by being bitten by an animal that carries this pathogen or eating contaminated food. So let me kind of summarize this here for you. Here's a house cat, all right? Goes outside, feeds on a bird or a mouse. Except these animals, they happen to have the parasite, Toxoplasma gondii. That cat comes back in the house, maybe licks a kid or bites that kid, and now the parasite that's present in saliva now gets into a wound. All right, that kid can now develop this. The biggest problem is this one here. You guys remember the torch panel, TORCH? Some of you might remember that. TO stands for Toxoplasma gondii. So again, the biggest problem is right over here. There's a pregnant woman. She gets that parasite from food or from the cat or whatever. That parasite gets into fetal circulation. You see what can happen now, right? This parasite can replicate in muscles and a bunch of other cells, but now we have a major infection in the fetus. And again, I'm going to point out the significant things here. So in fetuses, you can have many different problems. Think about this. You can have neurological damage, hydrocephalus, like you see back here. You can have problems with the eyesight, spontaneous abortions. You can have stillbirth occurring because of this infection, right? There's a parasite growing in muscle. That's, by the way, this is cardiac muscle. You can actually see, yeah. You can see that, I can't even tell you that skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle. The cardiac muscle, if you recall, they have intercalated disc. I don't see that there. In any case, these are muscle cells that are infected with this branch. It's probably cardiac muscle, but infected by this pathogen, all right? So again, babies, pregnant women, fetuses, very susceptible. Of course, AIDS patients, very susceptible to this. These are immunocompromised patients. And again, you can have infections practically anywhere, even in the central nervous system, all right? It's just a very nasty. Now, next on the list is the one that causes African sleeping sickness. And again, a few of you actually presented this in your lab sections. So the parasite that causes this is Trypanosome brucei. Right over here, there are two major subspecies. I'm going to mention them in a bit. But this is vectored. It's vectored by this fly back here. That fly is called a tsetse fly. It's also called the Glossina. This is a scientific name for it, the Glossina fly. By the way, here's a nice little diagram. This is a blood smear, a figure. You can see this parasite back here. Actually, it's pretty to look at. Very beautiful, actually. It's about 4 times the size of a red blood cell. So here's the parasite back here. This is a red blood cell. Very easy to spot on a slide. So here's what happens. This vector, the Glossina fly or tsetse fly, bites an individual. So, and that bite site, this creates an ulcer. If there's pathogens in there, in other words, trypanosoma, it can get into tissues and it can go to the bloodstream. All right. The biggest thing, though, with this parasite, it can cross the blood-brain barrier. And once it gets into the brain, you know, if it progresses to a certain point, there's no return. The patient will die. All right. There are 2 major varieties of this one. The less innocuous one, or I would say the more innocuous one, is this one here. By the way, they're all bad, so don't get me wrong. Trypanosome brucei gambians. This is Western Africa. This is where you find these ones here, or this variety. In the eastern front, we have Trypanosome brucei rhodesians. This one, the disease occurs more rapidly. People can slip into coma pretty rapidly with this one compared to the gambians. All right. So again, this tells you about the basic things I want you to know. And again, for gambians, it progresses slowly. It's the, quote, milder one. It's not good by any means, but it's the milder ones. The ones in the east that you see primarily in the East Africa is Trypanosome brucei rhodesians. This one progresses more rapidly. So what does it progress to? Think about the term African sleeping sickness. So at some point, people end up in coma and they die. That's what we're getting, right? And again, that could take several months or even a couple of years, or several years, actually. So these organisms, they produce a chemical tryptophan right over here. This is a chemical that can induce comas. In other words, sleeping. Think about it that way, right? Here are some pictures of people who are infected with Trypanosome brucei. This person is in the final stages of life. So he's already in coma. There's a reason why. That parasite is in the brain. There's so much brain destruction that goes on. There's no recovery from this, all right? Now, don't get me wrong. You can treat this in the early stages. It might be difficult to treat in some individuals, but generally for any disease in the primary stages, that's the best time to treat this. Here's another picture. This was taken in Uganda in 1990. There's a woman taking care of her husband who's dying. And again, these are terrible conditions because there's a point of no return. There's so much damage in the brain. Person slips into coma and then they die. Think about prion disease. So we talked about that way back when, right? At some point, the brain becomes so much damaged, so damaged that you lose consciousness, you slip into coma, and you die. In a similar way, this is a parasite that can really destroy the central nervous system. Okay, so let's get to the life cycle. What do we see? First of all, let me go back to a couple slides. I want you to look at what we're looking for. Right here, these are called trypomastigotes. So when I say that term later on, you can see why it's so significant. This is the diagnostic stage. This is what you find in the bloodstream. All right, so we're looking for parasites that look like this. So here's what the life cycle looks like. And again, remember what I'm holding you for. Infective stage and diagnostic stage, and of course, the vector, what transmits this to us. So here's this tsetse fly, the Glossina as it's called, bites a human. What is it injecting into the human? Well, let's go back here. This here is called a metacyclic trypomastigote. That's what's being injected into the tissues, into human bloodstream. If you notice, this one develops into the trypomastigote. So the infective stage is the metacyclic trypomastigote. The stage that you find circulating in blood is this one here. It's called a trypomastigote. So again, we have a vector, tsetse fly or Glossina fly. We have the infective stage, which is called the metacyclic trypomastigote. And then we see the stage that we find in blood, which I showed you earlier. That is called a trypomastigote. Right? Okay, so the last disease on the list, two more. It's a different type of trypanosoma disease. So we just talked about African sleep and sickness caused by Trypanosome brucei. The one that we find in Western Africa is called a Gambiense. The one that we find in Eastern Africa is called Rhodesians. Now let's look at this part of the planet. We look in the Western Hemisphere. What do we see? Well, there's a parasite that looks just like it right over here. See that here? This is blood smear. You can see these parasites in the blood, except it's not like an S-shaped structure. Let me go back and show you what I mean. We can distinguish them based on their morphology. See how this is like an S-shaped structure, kind of loose. If we get to the one that we see in the Western Hemisphere, it's kind of C-shaped, more rigid, right? So again, this is the one that causes American trypanosomiasis. It's also called Chagas disease. We find this primarily in Mexico, Central and South America. Of course, we have about 300. It's estimated people are migrating to the country, the United States. If you go to the border states, the estimates are pretty high, actually, anywhere between 300. So this is around the border area, 300 to about 1 million people who actually have this disease. So what is this disease about? Well, first of all, the organism that causes this is Trypanosoma cruzi, not brucei, Rhodesians, or Gambians, but it's Trypanosoma cruzi. It's transmitted not by the tsetse fly, but something called a reduvid bug. It's also called a kissing bug or the triatoma bug. It's all the same. But nonetheless, it's called the kissing bug or the triatoma bug or the reduvid bug. It has a parasite. This one, actually, the bug bites a human and transmits the parasite to humans. Parasite gets into the bloodstream, so now we have the trypomastigote, and then this can actually infect other tissues. I'm going to have a different type of infective stage here too. Or in fact, I'm sorry, diagnostic stage. In addition to the trypomastigote, which is what you find in blood, you can find the parasite in tissues like muscle, for example. That's the emastigote stage, all right? This one is a progressive disease. It's slow. It takes about 10 to 30 years or sometimes even more before you see major destruction where the person dies. So again, let me summarize this slide for you. American trypanosomiasis, also called a Chagas disease, transmitted by transmitted by this bug here, is the reduvid bug or the kissing bug or the triatoma bug. What's the name of the parasite? Trypanosoma cruzi. All right? Now here's what you see. This is over time. It's a chronic disease. So forget about the kid for a second. Let's take a look at this heart back here. See all this? It's kind of messed up, right? I mean, this is taken from autopsy. You see lots of destruction here of heart muscle, cardiomyocytes. And then this is in the brain. Take this from a human, by the way. Take a look at this. That's all bad stuff. It's caused by this organism, Trypanosome cruzi. Does it happen right away? No, it's a chronic disease. It takes a long time for this thing to develop. But again, if you get to these stages here, like in the heart, that heart's gone. And the brain, of course, there's no return from something like this. All right? If ever, again, forget about this one here. That's not for you. If you go down to South America, Brazil in particular, you see little kids with this swelling inflammation under the eye. That is called a Romana sign. All right, here's what happens. The kid's sleeping, that red of it bug comes by and bites, and of course, puts all the stool and saliva and stuff into the skin. There's an allergic response that results in swelling. Now, that may or may not contain the pathogen or the parasite, but it could. And of course, that parasite can develop, infect tissues like the heart or the brain. So again, if you take a look at the stats, about 10% people die who have Chagas disease. It just depends on where that pathogen ends up. Again, from something like this, the brain, there's no return. All right, you just destroyed a major part of the central nervous system. The cardiovascular system, and if it's so extensive, it's hard to escape death from something like this. All right? So let me just say a few things about the cycle, life cycle. Again, remember what I want you to know. Infective stage, right? The vector, and then, of course, the diagnostic stage. So this is a little different from the African sleeping sickness one. So here's a few points. What transmits this to us is the triatoma bug or the red of it bug, same thing. The metacyclic form is transmitted to us. This is the infective stage. What happens, this can actually develop in tissues. So here's one difference, all right, major difference. We can see amastigotes in muscle, for example, or in the brain. Now, these amastigotes break off from these tissues, and you can find them in blood. This is the stage we find in blood. So if you did a blood smear, you're going to find a tripomastigote. We saw that before with African trypanosomiasis. If you look at tissues now, if you did the tissue biopsy, let's just say brain or heart or liver, what you can see is the amastigote stage. So we can see both in humans. For African trypanosomiasis, we only see the tripomastigote. We don't see the stage at all. All right? So let me point it out for you. The bug that transmits this to us is the triatoma bug, also called the red of it bug. The form of the parasite that transmits to us is called here we go, right over here. It's called a metacyclic tripomastigote, right over here. Okay? What you find, this is the infective stage, metacyclic tripomastigote. What you find in humans, in tissues, that's called a amastigote. And what you find in the bloodstream, these can actually break off. These amastigotes develop into the tripomastigotes in the bloodstream. All right? And again, the numbers are staggering. It's nothing like other worm disease where you see hundreds of millions of people. In Central and Latin America, we see about 7 to 8 million people. The numbers are probably higher. I mean, right at the border, it's estimated to be just at the US-Mexico border, anywhere between 300,000, check that out, to about 1 million people. Most of them actually originated from Mexico or Central America or South America. So it's becoming more frequent, all right? Now, the last on the list today is this one here. It's an organism that causes a very nasty disease. In fact, let me just take you back in time. You guys probably remember something called meningococcal meningitis. It's caused by a bacterium, Neisseria meningitidis. I told you a kid can be playing in a soccer field and in 2 days end up in the ER in a coma, and you see spots on the skin. Then the central nervous system becomes involved, and on occasions that person can die well within 2 or 3 days. Now, let's kind of put this towards parasites. There's a disease similar to that. It's not caused by a bacterium. It's caused by a parasite. This one loves to go to the central nervous system also, especially the brain. All right? The name of this organism is Naegleria fowleri. Now, you probably occasionally hear this on the news. Somebody had a parasite in the brain and they died in 2 days. It's this organism. So it's Naegleria fowleri. It causes a disease called primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. So here's what happens. People go swimming. They swim in waters, lakes, for example, or pools. And just by chance, this organism gets into the nasal passages. From there, it can slip into the brain. And it can develop a really bad infection pretty rapidly. In about 2 days, you have major encephalitis, the swelling of the brain, and then a person slips into coma and die. So you have to catch this one on time. Just like we saw for meningococcal meningitis, you have to catch this on time. And then you have to treat appropriately. How do you distinguish this from meningococcal meningitis? Generally, there's no spots on the skin, all right? And there's a history. You take the patient's history. Well, he went swimming in a lake. Or that person from meningococcal meningitis was playing soccer in the field. That's differential diagnosis. Those are the things to think about this. You're in the ER and you're taking a patient's history, and both of them is serious disease. Patients are in coma. You're thinking central nervous system involvement. Well, how do you distinguish this from the bacterial one? Well, that person was playing on the soccer field, has spots on the skin, meningococcal meningitis. All right, this one, no spots on the skin, but the person was swimming in a lake, and now you have a problem. All right. So again, it causes a primary disease. It doesn't go to the intestinal tract. It goes straight to the brain, typically from the nasal passages. So again, this is a really nasty one. There's another species that doesn't cause much of a problem. Let me rephrase. Any infection is a problem, but it's not as nasty as Naegleria fowleri. This one is called Acanthamoeba species. Typically, it involves the eyes. All right. Occasionally, you can have a central nervous system involvement or the lung involvement. But the biggest one back here is this one. This is the most potent one, Naegleria fowleri. All right. So again, people go swimming in lakes, for example. That organism, the cyst present there, it becomes this is what happens in water. Cyst, the trophozoite, and then of course the trophozoite can enter the brain from the nasal passages to end up with this really nasty. Okay. All right, guys, so we're done with the unicellular parasites. These are the small ones you need a microscope to see. We're going to spend the rest of the next lecture after your quiz on Wednesday on this last section. We're going to be looking at worms. So again, when you think about parasites, you think about worms. We're going to focus on some worm diseases, all right? And then we're done with lecture. So we should be done by Wednesday. And we probably have next quiz number 9 on next Monday. I'm not certain about that yet. We'll have 8 by Wednesday. I'd like to give you another one, so you can drop at least 3 if you've taken them all. Well, you can drop 3 if you've taken them all. All right, so let me stop here. Let me ask, are there any questions? I know it's a lot, but we're not going to go through the whole chapter.
Quick question. So
yeah, go for it.
Okay, so for what was it African sleeping disease? Like what was the what was the vector in the infective stage again?
All right, so the vector is this animal back here. It's a little fly. It's called the tsetse fly or the Glossina. That's the scientific name for it. And the infective stage, if you go back to the slide back here, it's a metacyclic trichomastigote. It's the same that we saw for Chagas disease or American trypanosomiasis, except the vectors are different, right? The vector for the American one or Chagas disease, it is the red ovid bug, or it's also called the triatoma bug or the kissing bug.
Well, thanks.
All right, no problem.
Professor, for the final, will it open a couple minutes before or exactly at 2:30?
No, so for the quizzes and final, all the exams, you have about 10 to 15 minutes. In fact, I made it 15 minutes now, so this has not changed. All right. So you know what your time is. This class is 2:30. You have 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after to access the exam. If you do this before or after that time, you won't be able to enter. All right. But once you're in there, you have an hour for your exam, but for the final, it's 2 hours. Are we good?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, good.
Professor.
Other questions?
Professor?
Yeah?
So just to clarify, we don't usually have classes on Friday, but our final is on Friday. On a Friday, I mean.
Yeah, that's the date they gave me. So
Okay.
I know it's kind of weird. I thought about it. I say, wow, I do have one class Monday, Wednesday, Friday. That's the 8:50 to 9:15. But yours, you're right. It's only Monday, Wednesday. But that's the date they gave me
Okay, thank you so much.
because you guys should not have an exam at that time.
And for the quiz on Wednesday, it's just on fungi.
That's right. I did send an email to you guys. It's also an announcement. So yes, just fungi only.
Thank
Nothing
you.
on parasites. All right, have a good one. All right, guys, you can leave if you want to because I have your attendance. But if you want to ask me questions, I'm still hanging around for a little bit.
Thank you, Professor.